There are some early naturalists like Ernest Thompson Seton back in the 1920s. He estimated there were 1.5 to 2 million bighorn sheep in the West.
Bighorn sheep used to be in a lot of different places in Western North America, and all the way from Mexico to halfway north through British Columbia and Alberta, and as far east as Nebraska or South Dakota and North Dakota. And, there's really occupied a diverse set of landscapes, from high alpine environments to prairie, breaky country.
With European settlement, like many of our other large mammal species, they were overexploited and also were exposed to domestic livestock diseases, and resulted in catastrophic losses of both range and numbers of bighorn throughout their native range.
So there was unregulated hunting and take that reduced a lot of bighorn sheep numbers.
With the development of urban communities and major mining activities in Montana, then a lot of at least our large mammal resources were commercially harvested to help supply those folks in the urban environments, and bighorn sheep were heavily harvested, especially those sheep that wintered in lower elevation areas where they were more accessible.
Probably one of the biggest changes is when domestic livestock came into the West.
Between the competition of unregulated livestock grazing on native ranges and the introduction of these exotic pathogens, respiratory pathogens, that indeed contributed to the dramatic decline in bighorn sheep throughout Western North America.
There's always a few strongholds for these animals, and wildlife managers have taken some animals from those strongholds and then translocated them into new areas.
Westwide, it's pretty amazing when you think about almost 1,500 transplants, almost 22,000 sheep over the last 100 years. That's pretty dramatic efforts to try and restore that. Current estimates right now show that there are about 85,000 bighorn sheep in the western U.S., the 2 Canadian provinces, and the estimates out of 6 states in Mexico.
We're definitely making progress, and things are much better than they were, but just compared to what managers were able to do for deer and elk, it just hasn't been the same for bighorn sheep.
One has to go through a series of political and biological factors to help bighorn spread on a mountain, and they're not easy.
We've been at it for 80 years now. We still have a long ways to go to have our native range reoccupied. And so it certainly suggests that there's something about bighorn sheep, that they don't spread out well when we do restore them into native range. And those ranges are still quite intact. Most of them are public. And I don't think it's an issue of habitat limitation and habitat modification that's keeping bighorn sheep restoration to the modest level of success that we have today. We definitely have evidence where commingling of domestic sheep over recent times with bighorn sheep have precipitated catastrophic pneumonia die-offs soon after the commingling event.
You talk to all the experts, the wildlife veterinarians, the researchers that have done this. They say, we don't have this figured out, but until we do, the best thing you can do is keep domestic sheep and goats away from wild sheep.
Most of the Western agencies have a policy of trying to keep domestic sheep several miles, up to 10, 14 miles, separation between domestic sheep on public and private land And the reason for that relatively large distance, young rams or even mature rams are seen far from their normal ranges during the breeding season, and those are the animals that may come into contact with domestic sheep.
FWP has strategies for managing in a variety of contexts, where there's domestic sheep allotments on public lands, working with private producers. Every domestic sheep or goat owner that I've talked to, folks want to work with us. They want to be able to figure out how to have their domestic operations and have wild sheep too. All these folks that I've talked to are interested in helping with wild sheep conservation.
We've been working with mostly sheep, sometimes cattle, since we started here. Well, I don't view it as a threat to my operation per se. I view my operation as a threat to bighorns. And, you know, in the last few years, this has been a fairly specific topic because there was a proposed reintroduction of bighorns into the Bridgers. Historically, bighorns were native here. I talked to a guy, and he has memories maybe 50, 60 years ago looking out his window in the hills right after dinner and sometimes seeing 90 head of bighorn right in the foothills. And so that really gives me pause in trying to understand how we all should be thinking about this.
Eight years ago, we started studies in the greater Yellowstone area. We have been and continue to work in all of the bighorn herds in the GYA. We still have major outbreaks of pneumonia events in bighorn sheep that have been restored into various mountain ranges and somewhat into the prairie environments as well, indicating that we do still have a problem with disease. There's a general belief that most of the die-offs that occur are due to relatively recent introductions of novel exotic pathogens into the herds that the herds are then naive to and cause catastrophic die-offs.
Or they could be caused by something that's already hosted by at least one animal in that population, and then some condition or change in conditions allows that already present pathogen to propagate and proliferate and cause infection in a large proportion of the population. The reason we're viewing the problem in that context is because the management to prevent disease caused by those two different processes is really different. Regardless of whether people think that idea makes sense of these pathogens already hosted in a population causing disease, it's something that should at least be addressed, so then managers have some idea of what they can do more to try to reduce the impact of respiratory disease in bighorn sheep.
Bighorn sheep, there's simply something we don't know about their ecology and behavior that make them a little bit different beyond just the fact that they're carrying these exotic pathogens as well.
Although bighorn sheep were widely distributed, they're still somewhat habitat specialists, just because they do like this, quote unquote escape terrain. So maybe because of that, they don't have that natural propensity to colonize new areas like a deer or an elk does. In Montana, we'll have a population of 100 animals or 200 animals oftentimes. They're one group in the wintertime. And yeah, when you go down to Cody, Wyoming, you just see small herds of bighorn sheep scattered all over the place. And so it seems like they're really utilizing the habitat that's available to them much more than the bighorn populations we have in Montana. There's some indication that they do experience disease. The difference is after that happens, there's not just a couple dozen animals left. There's still this giant intact metapopulation that, even though one segment may be down, the rest of them aren't, and so as a whole it seems to operate pretty well.
When I came on the scene, Henry's Mountains, there were occasional sightings in there, but not really a population. Moose Creek and Sun Creek, the sheep have long been pretty stable up there, about 30 to 40 animals. But Wolf Creek and Indian Creek had no sheep, nor they had sheep since the 60s. And so those were winter ranges that were ripe for more sheep. What we're doing today is moving sheep to a transplant site that's also within the Madison Valley. This kind of an experiment that FWP and MSU are doing. This is kind of a neat story, I think. The Madison Valley has winter ranges for bighorn sheep all up and down it, but only 2 winter ranges are currently occupied. So there's a lot of habitat potential out there for the sheep. So getting sheep from this winter range, where they've got a very strong and high population, and moving them to help them rediscover some of these historic winter ranges can mean more sheep on the mountain, can mean better disease resistance, can mean better genetics, more tags for hunters. We can take a whole variety of disease panels, swabs of the nose and the throat, take the blood. I have the opportunity to put on collars, and then we can load them up in a trailer. And then they get unblindfolded, unhobbled, and they're ready to go. It's pretty great seeing sheep in Indian Creek, and in Wolf Creek, and in Bad Luck Creek, and in Moose Creek, and at Slide Inn, and I've even seen some rams now go over to Henry's Mountains by themselves. So we're starting to see, instead of there just being one bag of, one basket of eggs, one sheep herd at Quake Lake, we now have sheep wintering across a huge proportion of the Madison Range. But because of our transplants, we've probably had 120 people, students and families and kids and neighbors and landowners and outfitters and sportsmen have gotten to come and experience bighorn sheep. And because they see it and they get their hands on it and they get to feel like they're a part of something greater, they care. They care a ton about it. That kind of thing generates conservation interest. And that's pretty cool. That's a measure of success right there.
I don't think it means the death of agriculture. I think, in fact, almost the opposite is true. I think that if we don't learn how to farm as if nature matters, to quote a friend of mine, then it's at our peril, not just the peril of wildlife.
That's some of what we're trying to, the collective we're trying to work on, is some dialogue and some discussion with, say, the Montana wool growers or individual producers or permittees. Where can you have domestic sheep on the landscape that you're not getting into bighorn range and vice versa? There is a way to get both on the landscape, but they need to be separated.
We have many more bighorn sheep than we did when we started restoration. And if one thinks that these pathogens have been circulating for at least 100, 120 years, then I think there's real hope that what we see is that some herds, despite harboring the pathogens, seem to be demographically robust, and others aren't. And that's really the fundamental premise behind our GYA and Montana studies, is that we probably are not going to be able to manage the pathogens. They've been loose on the landscape for over 100 years. They're resident in most of our populations, if not all, in some form.
Yeah, we're not there biologically, and I don't think we're there politically either. But yeah, if people are willing to work together and be honest with each other and be open with each other, it really, I think, comes down to people more than biology.